with our workshop, and I would pass over to you, Erich.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for this nice introduction. You said already most I would like to say. I'm handling here this workshop as professor of the Vienna University, not as a staff member of the European Commission, but I'm following closely what's happening here concerning the reform of the Common Agriculture Policy. And I have to say we are working very hard to get texts ready. We don't discuss anything about legal logic or visualization because there's no time doing that. Even if there are huge resources available from Parliament, Council, and Commission, there's still too much to do. And you also see quite clear, getting to yes is more important than having a nice text that's computable. I have prepared some slides, just mostly for the audience to get a bit know what we're doing here. I'll just wait a moment. Yeah, just go back a bit. So sorry, I have to. Okay, just I'll have to go back. So first of all, let's, as Stefan said, I'm working on that for now about more than 30 years. I'm coming from information retrieval. And some of you know the old legal database of European Union, the European Economic Community. SELEX was quite difficult representation of European law with a lot of metadata. And then I must also say, if you see this, the more I work in practice, the more I see we have to take into account the nature, the culture. And then we have our legal system, a bit like built from Kelsen. But altogether, we work on a culture of compliance that fits together, actually. We can't do everything by law. A lot has been done by culture. And you see it also in the European law that the more we do in culture, the more it's developing. And a lot of what Europe is working is the culture of the businesses, of the administrations working together for European legal system. It's a bit like in the sense of Robert Schuman. We're working more on that. When you see the legal system databases, it's quite clear. We're considering on positive law. That's it. The ought, that's all. So it's, we will know that something is missing, and not all rules are very hard. Some are very soft. And we as specialists in legal information retrieval, as legal informatics, we worked a lot on documentation, and that's also the main goal. Bringing the text into accessible databases, search facilities, and some metadata. I refer to the World Legal Information Institute movement, the free access to law movement. Then in Europe, much stronger is the movement of the official journals. There's also an association, an informal one, with annual meetings. And then what's left for the lawyers, Stefan would like is a lawyer and computer scientist, structural analysis, what's in it, how we understand it, how we make argumentation norms out of it. And it's quite clear on the one side, we have formal representation, that's what they call on bibliographic information, citations, the Sauri classification codes. And here we have always the knowledge acquisition gap, or even if you have huge resources, particularly considering the 450 million Europeans looking what's in the official journal, then you can do a lot, but still you can't solve everything. That's a bit of a problem. So we have to prove it a bit more. And as we've spoken in the last days, it's mostly getting some kind of a more computer readable interpretation of law. And that's mostly legal data analysis. And the main goal is always how we can automate this. And also when it comes to today's workshop on the parliaments, how we can support this kind of process. I may remind it, and Volker Heydt may know that there's the Hofeld work, quite old, 100 years old, and Lehman Allen and Paul Pernet, one is a professor in I guess in United States in the Midwest, and the other one responsible for Cilex, tried to make European law more formal, say what's the rule, what's not the rule, and what type of rule it is. But that didn't succeed, actually. So if we don't do this, we have to work a bit on one side, how we can understand, automate the rules as such, what the lawyers are doing, because in the very end, you can't say to your client, that's the obligation, maybe, maybe not. You have to find a way what he has to do. And this supporting by tools or also by the parliaments as such is the goal as such. Legal data science would mean that the science is doing it. Here you see a bit the work I've done. And Volker Heydt will speak more about it. We have rules on communication of law. That's in all European jurisdictions. What's not published is not law. There's a bit, as you know, the judgments are very often missing. It's developing. But what's missing is now the decisions of the administration. Some are, for instance, when it comes to state aids, but others like building law is not published, not easily available. But there may be more common with the new Data Governance Act of European Unit, where more data is available and can be published by the practice. And what I see, and also from developments on the dynamic legal electronic commentary, some kind of a new representation, also taking into account legal analysis, like in the commentary, that we should move more a bit like not only text, that's for the lawyers, but visualizations, that's for the public. And we see there's these help sites. Europe has one, Austria has one. That's moving quite strongly in this direction. Visualization is not great, it's mostly procedural, but gives access to institutions, information about institutions, and also about the whole process, the kind of forms you need, what you have to do, and what you have to wait, and all this. That's a quite good start. But the next is also the apps as such, mostly from the citizen here, what he can do, what he has to do if the new rules applies to him. An app is nothing more than a computable form of legislation. And the question is, nowadays, what can we do as parliaments, administrations to support this process? It means we have some kind of 3 tiers or a holy trinity with a text visualization for the citizen and a code for the computer. That's a long-lasting goal, but we have to keep it in mind, and it may also be, as considering the discussions in the last days of this ReMeP workshop conference, it could also help the parliaments, the legal experts, to a bit consider more what they have in mind, what to do. And as you know from practice nowadays in the parliament, getting to yes is so important that you don't even contend. There are legal experts that understand what's going on, that works, but still when it comes to the public, they're a bit lost. And when they say, yes, is there a nice app where I can know what I have to do and all this, that's missing. And I guess as parliaments, publication offices, they should have some control about the whole process. And this is the aim, the goal of this workshop. Can we do that? What's the cost? And also, if you have an app, if you have a visualization, what's the legal quality of this? Because one is clear in the very end, text is king. So disputes are decided on the text by the lawyers. But 99% of cases may be solved just using a nice visualization, an app. And maybe Günther Schafer will speak about some Austrian practice that's on rent law, but still quite nice work using quite simple tools. So you see a bit what's it, but we come to it a bit later. So we have the text as such, we have visualization, and we have a logical form. And As you may see also that we have done some work on that, particular with Lachmeier, and also Hans-Georf, the program chair. When you have a nice representation in logic, you can also then move to a representation, a visualization. So that can be also done. And there's a lot of theory, in particular in business informatics, how to make code visible in a quite understandable form. Just one last comment as such, what's also often in the whole logic reprogramming, we have to focus much more on applicability. That means, particularly in European law, so many rules don't apply to the citizen as such. They're mostly concerned to businesses producing a product or doing a service. There are many more rules. They're focusing on them, and they have the practice. But and then others, what I've seen also in the agriculture law, the time issue is quite important, and very often in the logical application, it's not very clear. And when you see the information retrieval, time is much better solved there than all this artificial intelligence implication. They forget a bit the time. And just saying time as a final note, time in law means mostly a day. So because official journals change every day, not every hour. Court decisions may change in an hour, but that's not so relevant. Mostly a day is our challenge, and it means we have mostly the working days, 200 working days a year, where the law may change. And as you know, as a lawyer, you have to know always the state of the art. If something is changing and you don't take into account, that's a very serious negligence, and you may be liable for that. So lawyers have a huge burden, a knowledge burden, and all the tools we have are important, and the more we have, the better it is. So I'll stop now, and I will share the slides. There's a bit more on the whole methodology, but I would like to give the room to our panel. And with a quite distinguished panel, I'll introduce each of them very shortly. Matthew Beddington is from the Legislative Drafting Office of Jersey. He's a writer of laws in Jersey, very experienced, and also considering why not do it in a different way. He will start. Then with Volker Heydt, he was a retired, as they call it in the European Commission, administrator, but administrator is mostly an expert. In Austrian law, I would say it's a Rat, a Kommissionsrat, with long practice. But besides that, he's done a lot on Europe. He was the first with European stamp, actually, but also then official journal. He was always interested how we do the publishing and how we can improve that. Then we have Fotis, Fitsilis from the Greek Hellenic Parliament. We'll speak about the ideas there. Then we have Günther Schefbeck from the Austrian Parliament. They have done a lot on text improvement, but maybe they consider more. Then not yet here is Burkhard Schafer from the University of Edinburgh. He's bringing a bit more the common law approach that we know the law as experts and we publish it somehow. And we'll see if Adam Wyner can join us. He's a quite busy man. He's from the US of Swansea. He's running a huge project on legal tech. So I'll give the floor now to Matthew, because it's a very nice presentation and also covering a bit the other jurisdictions, what I have in mind, much more than I expected. So we're looking forward to your presentation. So I'll stop my screen and I give it now to you, Matthew, to start. If you would like to say a bit more about you, please do.
Thank you.
We have about presentation, about 8 to 10 minutes, each of them. Okay, Matthew, please.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen, just take a moment. So yes, I work in a legislative drafting office. I write the rules that confuse everybody day to day. But I've been looking at how these rules could be, the clarity of these rules could be helped by digital processes. I should say first of all that I only speak for myself on this. I'm not speaking for the Government of Jersey or the Parliament of Jersey. And nor do I speak for the whole of the rules as code movement, which is what I'm going to be talking about. I've got a particular legislative draft as slant on it. Rules as code may or may not be familiar as an idea to some of the people listening. These slides will be available afterwards, so I've put various links on that I won't spend time talking about, but the idea is set out in various websites, and there are governments, particularly in the Commonwealth, the British Commonwealth, that have been taking it up, started in New Zealand. The concept itself is very loose, and it's now being used as a label for all computational law. But the idea that I'm going to be talking about is the original idea based on what happened in New Zealand. And the point there is to produce something that is coded at the same time as producing your legislation, coded or marked up. Then governments would publish that code alongside the way that they publish the text of the legislation. They published on API so that computers could access it. And the idea then would be that it's not for governments to be writing programs to execute anything or to give people advice. That's for external software developers. So they would then have a common source of updated information about the rules that they could rely on, rather than making it up themselves as they do at the moment. The rules as code movement started in about 2018. I've been interested in it since I first heard of it, but as a drafter, I've been a bit busy with Brexit and then COVID. I've put some links to some of the things that I've done there. One of the questions is, how do you actually achieve this code drafting of natural language text and some sort of code or markup? And the two basic models are obviously, one of them is there's always a drafter and a policy officer in the room. When something's being drafted, you can add a coder into the room. The other is that you could make the coding process so easy that even the drafters, the lawyers, could do it. Jason Morris, I would mention, talks about the idea that spreadsheets came along for accountants. Accountants didn't go out of business. They just became better at doing their job, and they don't even think about it as programming. Those two extreme approaches, obviously the middle way would be to have the legislative drafter use a no-code system and have a coder then refine what the legislative drafter has done. So I'll be very interested in this afternoon's talk about no-code. The publishing of it, again, it's still under consideration, but we already publish text of legislation. We don't publish anything when a court says, oh, this particular order is ultra vires, it's invalid, of no effect. These regulations actually where they say you must do this, you mustn't, and so on. We publish the text as a service to the public. We could be publishing the coded version in the same spirit. The coded version obviously would not be official, but could be explanatory, like much of the other explanatory material. And then it's for the external developers to worry about whether anything that they add to that is right or not. Commonwealth registered drafters are a fairly small set of lawyers who specialise in this day to day. We have an international association, and we have a modern style which is very much like a controlled natural language. Particularly, I've been talking to Professor Kowalski about logical English and the relationships there. So we stick to a set of rules in our modern legislation. Our statute books contain old legislation, obviously. And part of what we're thinking about is there are obviously people who've been working in this field for decades who are producing enormous quantities of work, but whether we can come together so that those of us who are producing the rules can make small steps towards what the ultimate goal might be. So if we are just trying something fairly limited, that might be a good start. If all we're trying to do is capture the logical relations inside our legal text, not the meaning of all the different terms, we're not getting rid of discretion, we're not getting rid of the word reasonable, we're not removing vagueness. Vagueness is fine. It's ambiguity that is a problem, particularly syntactic ambiguity. And in order to get people who are not familiar with technology to start thinking about this, I've been using Excel. I like to talk to people who understand tech and say I'm using Excel and make them laugh, because it is the tech people's image of lawyers that we are so ignorant of tech that even Excel seems amazing to us. But it's a way of getting people to engage with the if and or not logic of a text. And even when someone is just doing that, it starts the drafter thinking about how a lot of what they're doing can be expressed in if-then terms. I often think when people look at our finished product, they see a static finished product. But the fact is that behind the scenes, that finished product was drafted over and over and took many forms. And in fact, when the legislative drafter is sitting in their office on their own, they are thinking, should I put this as a person who does ABC must do D? Or should I put this as if a person does ABC, that person must do D? And generally, it makes no real difference which way I express it legally. What I'm after is the most concise and readily readable English text for a human reader. So I think there's a fair amount of scope for legislative drafters to be persuaded that a lot of what they do can be recast without damage as if-then propositions. But the act of doing that is educative in itself for legislative drafters to help us improve what we're already trying to do. We are trying to make our legislation logical, we're trying to make it consistent, and we're trying to make it unambiguous. Vague, fair enough, but unambiguous in the sense that we're not leaving two contradictory interpretations open. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen. And that's the end of my 10-minute presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very nice presentation.
I'll suggest that we move on to the next presentation and to the questions a bit later to get the full picture. Now, the next in my list would be Volker Heydt. He's covering a bigger jurisdiction, the European one. And he's very much concerned about the journal, a very huge journal, actually. In paper would be about 30 volumes a year, maybe a bit more. And there's a lot of investment in that money, the Office for Publications. And the main concern is quite clear in 23 languages, now also with Irish. That's a real strong concern, but a lot is working on, particularly on legal vocabulary, because you need to do the work. So it's for the smaller jurisdictions, smaller languages, some strong impetus for the development of the legal language too, yes. When you see for Estonian or Maltese or Irish, because there's some need to develop a good legal vocabulary. Anyhow, so Volker, you have the floor and give a bit about experience about all the problems with the journal. We can't hear you. Please unmute and share the screen, yes. Please unmute yourself. Unmute yourself, Volker. We can't hear you. We can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, excuse me. So good morning. I'm happy to be with you here. Unfortunately, it was very short notice that I was involved so far. It's very rough what I can only submit. Nevertheless, rather talk from some kind of past experiences, and it's rather kind of constitutional aspects rather than technical ones, but of course there are links which I'll refer to as well. All the legal publications of the EU are, of course, in the general framework of the access to law aspect, transparency, publication culture, and so on. And we are several actors. Next slide, please. There are several actors who are working under these rules, which are mostly very unspecific and in particular do not contain any kind of technical aspects. The official journal is just mentioned without leaving any further obligation to implement it. It was tradition, how it was done, like traditionally one publishes an official journal, and there was nothing for a long time, no implementing act. The only act, the first act to implement this rule of the treaties of the original ones was the question of the languages. That's the famous regulation number 1. But so far, nothing more has been done. Then, the next one, the most important actors in these sorry, it was not the next slide yet. So, there's a very strange legal act which is framing the EU publications. That's this famous decision of 2009. Now there exists a consolidated version, but it's something which I was always puzzled with, that this is a constitutionally very strange act. The only decision of all institutions altogether. It would normally have been a normal legal act done by a proposal of the Commission, adopted by Council and Parliament. But here they have decided to make a decision. I do not know what this, what's the reason for this. It's a unique act of this kind in the whole EU area. But nevertheless, it sets up the Publications Office as an interinstitutional body, which is managed by the Commission. But it is very independent. It's located in Luxembourg, and its first or most prominent task is the publication of the law of the official journal. And they are busy with this in a lot of issues. There was another legal act on electronic publication, which was the result or was in the context of a judgment by the Court of Justice in the case Skoma Lux, where the electronic publication had to be sanctioned, had to be authenticated by a special legal act. And since then, the legal acts are authentically only in the electronic version now. I omit here reference to publications by the Court of Justice. Of course, judgments also are delivered in public sessions, but their publication is not ruled in any kind of legal text like that. It's not even in the rules of procedure of the court they are mentioned, just in, strangely enough, just in the rules of procedure of the tribunal of first instance, as it was formerly said, now the court. Okay, that's it. Next slide, please. As I said, the Publications Office has a major role to play and is, let's say, a technical support service for the production of the publications of all institutions with regard and let's say they're supervised by a management committee in which all the institutions which were mentioned before in the decision are represented, but actually they are working on proposal of the Publications Office, and there are sometimes small discussions about what's to go on, but the general orientations are coming from there, but the management committee does not intervene in technical issues, although mainly, of course, the main legislators, Parliament and the Council and Commission, they have their particular wishes which they present there and which can be taken on board, but this is something which is, let's say, is not a very important one. The main bulk is the Publications Office with its director and its numerous staff. That's the next slide, please. We have, next slide, please. Yeah, so the publication of the authentic text, that's the point which is important and important for the accessibility. And per se, in former times, we had bulks, really piles of official journals in the office, and nobody knew where to find anything if there was not a concrete quote of a page or of an issue, because there was no access at all. This has luckily been overcome, but there was no directory either. There was no index, nothing. So help. It was not due to, not yet due to IT technique, but it was done rather manually. That something had been set up. Anyhow, a directory of legislation, a kind of index, an index which was based on a structure which has been developed by the Publications Office, had been put, and thus now it's available online on the Erich database. Next slide, please. As regards the drafting of legislation, there's of course a kind of competition, I might say, or repartition of tasks. The legislative organs, that means the Commission as proposing, and the Commission as proposing, and the Council and Parliament as legislating, they intervene. They have their own rules. They had originally different rules. They have tried to come together and to have institutional agreements about how to do them, but these have come. They still have their certain ideas and do not always come to an agreement. but the main bulk of the technical implementation has been done by the interinstitutional style guide, which the office has set up, which include formatting, the numbering of acts, and also the question of consolidated acts, which are not legally binding, but they are useful to be how to the extent that they are useful. Big discussion with private editors of codifications, but they are actually presented and they are worked out and available on the database. And then there we have finally, I come to the next slide, please. And there is a small interaction with legal legislation to the extent that EU legislation requires the member states to refer to the underlying EU act, if it's an implementing measure, of course. But member states have not been able to come to a general rule. They have come to an agreement to say, well, we should mention it there, but it is enough that it is mentioned on the, let's say, on the cover page of the national official journal, that the reference is mentioned there. Was in particular Denmark, which was reluctant to have it an obligation to quote it in the act, in the implementing itself. Well, then we have big need of tables of correspondence, which are unfortunately not well served by member states. The Commission has failed so far to introduce a common format for this, and the Office for Publication is not involved in this. That is left to the Commission, if it's to be done. So, moreover, the measures of member states which are implementing legislation are difficultly usable for everybody. If you know that there is an implementing act by the Czech Republic, it's only a few people who are able to handle it concretely, because they need the translation, first of all. There is a big potential for electronic development in the interaction of the different partners of the legislation, and in particular also with national legislatures. So far, you will see that much more is needed to be developed, and I'm happy that this conference is showing ways how to do this. And fortunately, I'm too old in order to go into the current new developments. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Volker. You've given a very good picture about the daily problems. Yes, so there are many problems presenting the European law in the 23 languages, also now very soon Irish. And besides the huge experience, there's not much time left doing computational law or doing visualization. That's a bit left to the Commission services to do a bit more. There's also a service available on summaries. That's the former SCART service. A lot of metadata is done. And also is a cooperation with Google. So they're using the Alex database, that's not a publication service is called mostly, for translations. And when you see when you have a directive, Google gets it very right in all different languages, and also the formulations as such. So there is some potential for research, but we'll see how we can move on. In particular, there is some, let's just write it, what it's called, so an XML version of writing European rules. That's done by the Commission and others. That's helpful, but it could move a bit further, and there's also with terminology development going on. And also the code is working on that. but still in the very end, there's so much to do and not enough time left to use computers or to get tutors properly trained to do good work. We'll see how it will come on. It's really a field of research work and also particularly applied research to do and do a bit more. Okay, then we move on to Fotis Fitsilis from the Hellenic Parliament from Athens. And he will speak about his experience. He in the Parliament of the Greek Republic. And you see, they've also quite nice ideas how this can be improved. And he has also a nice movie that he will then show us. Please, Fotis, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Schweighofer. Thanks everybody that attending from anywhere in the world. It's always a pleasure being among acknowledged scholars and practitioners, trying to communicate law, because this is what we try to do. I suppose if law was easily accessible and processable, and the information behind the law, the legal information, that we wouldn't have this conversation at all. But unfortunately, it isn't for reasons that Erich has already explained in his introductory words. So what does the parliament do that wants to dig in deep into this ground, wants to structure its legal information, wants to make it easier accessible to stakeholders, whether they are citizens, legal professionals, also IT developers who want to develop third-party applications. So how do we handle this? So that's not a straightforward answer. And I suppose every parliament does it differently or tries to handle it differently. I can tell you what my team has done for sure. We have founded a group of experts. We have founded a group of experts to work on decentralized on these common problems. And we named this group the Hellenic OCR team because we needed to do optical character recognition on the information to make it accessible, because we figured out that we worked for decades with paper, and this information is not accessible at all, apart from a few metadata, of course. And I kindly asked the production to run the video rather than me explaining how we started. I would leave the video do the job, and I'll come back in a few minutes with more information and the discussion. this is nothing else that the original working scheme of our team. And this video, by the way, can be openly seen on YouTube, or it can be found on our team's webpage, hellenicocrteam.gr. So the issue is one and only here, for at least for us. We wanted to apply legal informatics methodologies and ontologies and all that is considered to be state of the art right now, but we didn't have any data at all. So we need to start from scratch and create a legal database with our information regarding laws. And what we started with data from parliamentary questions, because questions are more concise and reproducible and more easy to describe for instance, in standardized format like a Commentoso or else, or any XML-based format. And this is what I have shown there. It was fairly straightforward, but what followed is not. So we thought, all right, now we have some data there. That's quite nice. So what can we do with that? And the idea spun out of our heads to experiment with some emerging tech applications, or I would say killer apps, because you need a few applications that are appealing to the general public or the users of parliamentary information before proceeding. So we thought about, okay, why not we studying recommender systems for parliaments? Now, the idea is not new. Recommender systems have been studied by the group of the campus in Andalusia, University of Granada, if my thoughts are correct. And we saw their work, and we wanted to reproduce it in the realm of the Hellenic Parliament. So we built a team with internal stakeholders, so people like myself and people from the IT department of the Parliament, but also academics from and people from the industry that would like to step in and offer their coding experience and capacity, of course. And the goal is to build a functional portal add-on that would be applied to our Parliament or any other parliamentary portal to help the user guide themselves through the parliamentary information, which are, of course, already in some sort of structured format. Otherwise, it's tough to get it. And recommender systems, now there has been already some classification work done. You can apply their artificial intelligence or machine learning algorithms to help the user learn from the user's guide path through the information, or it can be something like fixed classification. So if a user searches for a law on finance or budgeting, the user will be automatically suggested to take a look also on parliamentary questions regarding financing or budgeting. So the whole approach, how we structure this recommender systems, what kind of information we use, what kind of technologies, like AI-based technologies, we might introduce. This is work in progress, and I would like to inform both our panelists and the general public about that, because certainly we will need support and we will need the help and the information from the greater community on how to proceed on certain points. Therefore, the production will provide you with a few online polling questions on if and how would the public as citizens or any other stakeholders, would like to see such systems in practice. Are they useful? Do you consider them necessary? Because we might be wrong at all, and such systems are not necessary, at least in the present phase. So we would like to ask you and receive your precious input on that, and kindly respond to the questions asked. And if we will have the time, we will discuss the results at the end of the debating session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting approach. There were some questions in the chat, and we'll come to that a bit later. I now hand over to Günther Schefbeck, and I'm reminded of the famous German Chancellor, Bismarck, who said that, yeah, a law is like a sausage. Hopefully the product is eatable, good eatable, but we don't know, we wouldn't like to know how it's developed. And this is more true than ever, particularly European cyclists, in the United States, in the Washington cyclists. So many are working on the various laws, and to make it a good product, very often you need a group of lawyers, courts, to make it unworkable, particularly when lawmakers a bit disagree and like to move over the problem to the next stage. Günther Schefbeck has a huge experience as head of the, let's say, scientific service of the Austrian Parliament. He's done a lot on documentation. And he followed very closely also the Austrian e-law approach, making the law, the text exchangeable. So it's just to say that it's clear that parliaments, administrations don't work anymore with just Word documents. They have XML structures, they exchange documents. That's working quite well. A lot of reuse is going on, a lot of documentary work. So it's already a quite good standard, better than in the courts. And on European level, there's a group on legal informatics now focusing much more on courts because there's much more to do. But you will see it's the next move is a big step. So Günther, you have the floor.
Thank you, Erich. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for inviting me to tell a little bit about, well, let's call it the legislative environment, an environment in which I've been working for 35 years now. And so I thought it might be useful to introduce this debate to share with you a few thoughts about how the laws are produced, what challenges the lawmakers are facing, and what questions they have to deal with in the near and even more distant future. I would like to start with a quotation by Sir Geoffrey Bowman, former head of the Legislative Council or Parliamentary Council Department of the UK, who more or less argued for legislative drafting being rather an art than a precise science. And he argued if 5 drafters were set on the same bill, each might emerge with a different product, so they would come up with 5 different products. If they were working in Austria, they would even come up with 6 or more different products. Well, what does this mean? This very obviously means that even though there are legislative drafting rules, even though we can say that to some extent a legislative text is a controlled natural language, as it was put introductorily by our colleague from Jersey, these elements still would only cover part of legislative text. A major part of legislative text would still be produced in a more or less free or artificial way, taking into account political demands, taking into account a complex legislative process and its outcome, which very often is or regularly is compromise. Legislative processes are not only complex, they would also take place on very different levels. Of course, there is the formal level that is well described in the Constitution and in the rules of procedure, but there are many informal phases in advance of these formal stages and besides them. So besides each of these formal stages, the pre-parliamentary stage, the parliamentary committee stage, the parliamentary plenary stage of lawmaking, there are informal stages on which very often the real decisions are made. To describe legislation, describe legislation as a process, many cyclic models have been developed over the past decades. I present a very simple model which starts with what might be called agenda setting, discovering the matters that have to be dealt with by legislation. Then there would be a stage of policy making, which means making up a basic decision, an elementary decision on what objectives to be achieved and by what means these objectives, what political means, but what administrative means, these objectives would have to be achieved. Then this basic policy model, as I would call it, a policy model that would describe the objectives to be achieved and the aims to be used, the means to be used to achieve these objectives. This policy model would have to be transformed into a draft legal text. And then this draft legal text, as it has already been described, will undergo many, many iterations in the process of deliberation in advance of parliamentary deliberations and during parliamentary deliberations until finally, in a brief step, normally in the plenary of parliament, there would be adopted a final text that then would have been implemented and evaluated, which in the end would be the starting point for a new cycle, because on the ground of the evaluation of a piece of legislation that has been produced, a new agenda would have to be set, how to further develop this piece of legislation or other pieces of legislation that might be in some way or the other affected by the effects of the piece of legislation that has been produced before. This all complex process would be performed by a huge number of different actors. There would be institutional actors, there would be individual actors, there would be state actors, civil society actors, there would be political and administrative actors. So you can imagine that this huge number of people with their different backgrounds, educational backgrounds, knowledge backgrounds, capability backgrounds, with their different interests that they would like to get through the legislative process, have very different approaches that need to be in some way adjusted. The different interests need to be adjusted in a political compromise that has to be put into legislation, and the different backgrounds, the different technical, educational, capability backgrounds have to be adjusted by interaction methods, by interaction fora that would allow these different actors to come together and to interact with each other in the interest of finally producing a piece of legislation that would meet the societal needs the best possible way, which normally is a compromise that would bring in line the diverging interests or even conflicting interests of the different societal actors. And now we are at an important point that has already been briefly mentioned. That's the very reason why so often there is not only vagueness, but even ambiguity in legislation. That's not because the legislative drafters are incapable of doing their job, of producing precise text. They would be able if they had the political freedom to do so. But very often, vague formulations are a means of compromise, and in some cases, even ambiguous formulations are a means of compromise, which makes it so it's sometimes so difficult to extract from the legal text the rules, the logical rules that then might serve as algorithms to, for example, implement legislation by machines or through machines, or, for example, visualize rules contained in legal text to make them better understandable. So very often, this issue that we are encountering, that people have the impression, I don't really understand what a piece of legislation means, has a very good political reason. Not in all cases, but in a very many cases. So that's a brief description of legislation, the legislative process that has been developed over centuries. Legislative business is a very conservative business, as also the statement, the introductory statement by Geoffrey Bowman would indicate. Legislative drafters deem themselves artists, and they not only deem themselves, but they are standing in a tradition going back hundreds of years. Actually, nearly all parliaments in the world, more or less, are going back to the traditions of the UK, to the traditions of the English Parliament that started to work on a regular basis, let's say in the 14th, 15th century. So you can imagine it's not always easy to introduce innovation to Parliament and to introduce innovation to legislative business. But nowadays, we're living in a quickly changing world. And this means that even Parliament and that even legislation has to undergo changes. It has to undergo changes much quicker than it was used to over the past centuries, because the societal and technological challenges it's facing today will force it to undergo these changes. So just to close my introductory statement, I wanted to make you aware of a few, not all, a few of these challenges, of these horizons in which the normative business nowadays would be located. We are living in a society which is coined by what might be called globalized economy, globalization, one of the big buzzwords of the past decades. And another buzzword, we are living in an information society, like Manuel Castells has described it. So what does this mean for lawmaking? Is lawmaking traditionally set within a national environment? Nowadays, in Europe, within a supranational environment. But nonetheless, even integrated Europe is a small actor in a big globalized world. Is this traditional way of legislation still adequate to meet the requirements of this global economy and of this information society? Is it adequate to meet these requirements in terms of the speed of adapting the rules, in terms of the content of the rules, in terms of the way the rules are produced, the way the rules are presented, the way the rules may be implemented? I already suggested that one of the big issues is that legislation still is mostly seen a national business, a business of national jurisdictions. We have made in Europe this big step towards supranational legislation, which still, to some extent, is in conflict with a traditional understanding of national legislation. So still many MPs in the national parliaments feel to some extent cut down in their very own business by being forced to just implement European legal acts. We can't talk at all about global legislation nowadays. We can have a look at how, for example, the United Nations and its sub-organizations are producing normative texts in the form of multilateral treaties, and we know what an extremely clumsy business this would be. So that's not at all adequate to meet these requirements of quickly changing environments. Another big issue of our time is migration. People have become mobile. People would no longer be ready to spend their whole life in their mother country or father country, however you call it. They would migrate throughout continents, throughout the world. And this would also lead to conflicts between the personal status of people and the national jurisdiction that would be implementable, that would be executable on a particular topographical spot. So one discussion we also have is, to what extent this territorial principle of the application of laws that we have got used to over the past 200 years since the Age of Enlightenment can be at least complemented, if not replaced, by another principle of the application of law, which is a very old one, namely the personal principle. Look back to the Middle Ages, where people on a particular spot were not legally treated in accordance to the law of that spot, but of the law of their background, where they came from. So this personal principle might be another principle within the legislative environment that might gain importance again in the times to come. Another development we are observing is that more and more, in particular in business law or in business environments, what traditionally we might have called hard law would be complemented or even replaced by soft law, by codes of conduct. That's one of the big issues we have when dealing with transnational enterprises that would be located not only on Jersey, but somewhere else, where perhaps they have got an overproportional influence on local legislation. And
no, sorry, we have now 1 minute, about 2 minutes to finish.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for reminding me of my limits. Well, then I would just go down over some demands that legislative business has to meet. It has to be deliberative, it has to be evidence-based, its results have to be comprehensible. All these demands very often are deemed to be unsatisfactorily fulfilled. So how will we as legislators fulfill these demands better? A new challenge legislation has to meet is the challenge of a totally new type of actors, namely autonomous non-human actors. Machines might be e-persons that would complement the traditional physical persons or natural persons and legal persons that we are used to. So a totally new type of actors that has to be governed legally. And finally, a subject that maybe we will deal with more in the rest of the debate. In what way can we be able to turn legal text, the way that legislation is traditionally produced, into algorithms, or perhaps even the other way around? Would we be able to produce at least certain types of legislation in the form of algorithms and then transform these algorithms into standardized text? So I hope I haven't exceeded the time assigned to me too much, and I hope I have given some ideas for the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Günther. Just a small remark. The European Union is still considering itself as a major actor in international affairs. And yes, it's true that knowledge is much more important than it used to be, as regulation is now done also quite a lot by knowledge, and people are supposed to use it and take it as a guidance, because we're moving in so many different areas, and enforcement is more difficult than it used to be. Then if it's just penal law and some civil law, it's much easier for for regulation to handle that. Anyhow, now we had a lot of experience, and also thank you for the many questions. We come to that a bit later. We just do presentations from academics who both specialists in computational law, particularly Burkhard Schafer. He knows quite well what he can do and what can be done, also from the practice of civil law system, common law systems, and then last but not least, Wyner, who is a professor at Swansea and running a huge legal tech project. And Burkhard Schafer is a German, now a Scottish, and is professor at Edinburgh, and he knows quite well what he can do. And he's quite aware of the difficulties to make something that's a bit incoherent, inconsistent, in strange language, not understandable, to make it really in nice logical language that everybody can understand it. So Burkhard, you have the floor. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm quickly sharing my screen, if that works. Okay. And slideshow. Start. Just a sec. Final steps. Okay. Yes, I mean, just to give you a little bit of background of some of the work we are doing at the moment. I'm part of a large research network funded by UKRI, or funding agency, on trustworthy autonomous systems. And in Edinburgh in particular, we have the governance node of that network that looks at ways in which autonomous systems should be governed in the future. And what I find particularly interesting, and I think that sort of links to the topic of today, is to paraphrase massively Kant's from Perpetual Peace. Even a society of robots needs a state and therefore needs law. We can think of law at its most abstract also as a way in which autonomous systems interact with each other and interact with us. And that is obviously this notion of potentially coding directly legal rules into the software, hardwiring it, and coming to something that Miriam Hildebrand, for instance, has called ubiquitous law, so that legal norms are directly readable in our physical and built environment as a sort of particularly radical form for norms as architecture. And I was also involved with a project by AI for People as part of Atomium, the European Institute for Science, Media and Democracy. And in that context, we developed 3 reiteration of ethics guidelines for AI, most recently the ones that deal also with law and the question of law as a field of application of AI. And in that, bring these 2 fields together, I would say legislating code, and with that I mean giving an authoritative notion of laws that currently are still written in natural language as a form of code, will become necessary at some point. Because if the alternative is worse, what we find at the moment is that essentially software developers, programmers, make decisions that in the past had been reserved to either legislators or judges. So if you are building autonomous systems in various forms, autonomous cars, for instance, and you make decisions on how to represent laws in them formally, you make interpretative decisions that previously were reserved for courts to make. You disambiguate the rules. So lots and lots of decisions are made in a technocratic way behind the curtains that in the past would have been proper subject to parliamentary debate and scrutiny. So I think we are facing here, because of that popularity, increasing popularity and increasing importance of regulating behavior of autonomous systems through some form of codified law on their side, on the system side, on the machine side. I think we are at danger of creating a serious democratic deficit in technology regulation. So it seems to be inevitable to me that in the long run we bring this process back into the open, back into the public domain to create code versions of the law that are authoritative. In a way similar maybe to what we do in international law, where we also have authoritative versions in different languages of the same legal provision. And even though we know that no translation is perfect and the translator is always also a bit of a traitor, we can at least treat them from a legal perspective as equivalent. So legislating code at some point will become necessary, but it is also dangerous because, and that is just some of the dangers we flag up in the ethics paper. One is it can exclude citizens from the drafting process. If you look at legislation in the UK at the moment, they are typically coming together with extensive consultations. Expert opinions are gathered, public opinions are gathered, mini publics are convened. So there is by now, I think, a pretty extensive system to involve citizens also in the drafting and the legislative process. And that obviously becomes problematic if some part of these laws are not any longer human readable, but are intended to be primarily machine readable. And secondly, they can nudge legislators to suboptimal substantive rules simply for computational convenience. And I've seen that already happening, for instance, in social security law, where nuances, discretion, flexibility was designed out in the lawmaking stage simply to then enable faster and simpler computational rendition and automation of some of the decision-making processes. And I think that's, for me, massively the technological tail wagging the substantial legal dog. It should not be the case that what we want to express through a norm is already from the beginning restrained by what is technologically or computationally possible. So there are dangers in that, ethical, legal, and democratic dangers, even though I think it is ultimately necessary. There are solutions we can think of, both technological and legal. We can think of better ways to visualize and represent these new types of laws so that there is still the same degree of public participation, public understanding for them. We also need an explicit normative framework that clarifies the relation between the natural language version and the computational legal version in that vision where Parliament directly enacts forms of code as a version, as an authoritative version of the law. But I think also from the COVID experience, at least in the UK, and I suppose many other countries will have the same experience, we can also see how that model is potentially of wider application. One of the things we definitely encountered was that the need for speedy lawmaking outpaced the communication of these laws. That's not a new experience. We had the same in the foot and mouth epidemic a while ago, where almost on a daily basis, laws and rules were revised, new exclusion zones were created, the level in COVID cases, the levels were adjusted, and getting these new laws to those people who had to apply them, for instance, to the police to enforce them, turned out to be extremely difficult. So we had situations where police officers didn't know what the law was on the day where they're supposed to enforce it. We had situations where they were enforcing laws that had already been superseded by other laws or other rules. So here I think we saw a clear example of the benefit of rethinking this process in maybe a more rigorous way, where just like a push notification in software or a patch, we can think of these constant updates being delivered in a much more streamlined version to those that have to apply them on the ground. In the UK, we also had the problem that the highly geographic fragmentation posed additional challenges. health is devolved. So Wales, Scotland, and England came to their own solutions, but the borders between Wales and England in particular are obviously extremely fluid. So it was very difficult often to say where which laws applied simply by where you were. And again, I think we can learn here from the way software updates and software notifications are dealing with this. So my overall provocation, if you like, is in a world that we share more and more with autonomous systems, which we want to be law abiding, we have to find a way to communicate the laws to them. That will be in the form of codified laws, and we need to bring them back into the legislative and democratic process, because the alternative is to leave it to software developers to create de facto norms, which is not their role, which shouldn't be their role. But beyond that need to respond to automated system, I think crisis like COVID shows the advantage that can come with that through a more streamlined, faster process that learns from the agile software development way, also for sort of agile lawmaking. So yeah, that's already been me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Burkhard. Yes, it's true that the Parliament shouldn't forget the new actors, the robots, the agents, as addressees of the norms. I'll come to that later about what the product should be. But last but not least, we have Adam Wyner here. He's running a very huge legal tech project in Swansea. So he maybe have the resources, the possibilities to do what has to be done and say, yes, I show how I can do it. And from the, I wouldn't say it's a jurisdiction, but it's developing a jurisdiction, Wales, will do it in English and Welsh. He made a move on to the Europeans and show them how we can bring the law to the citizens in code, in text, and maybe also in visualization. So Adam, thank you for being with us. You have the floor. 10 minutes about.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for the invitation and also the kind words. I sort of found out about this a little bit late, my fault for not being on top of my correspondence. So I didn't make any slides. So I'll just make some remarks, which I liked Burkhard's mention of provocation. So that's what I would like to offer as well, maybe a different angle of the provocation. So really, I'll just emphasize a point that I think has already been raised and maybe sort of shift the aspect a little bit. So we know that we have a lot of formal and computational tools that we can apply to legal information. I've said for a while, and my colleagues would agree with me, that a really key problem in applying these formal and computational tools, by formal I mean logic or mathematics, and by computational I mean how you might implement these things in some kind of specific code, or how you might represent something in an ontology or some other knowledge structure. The problem is, how do you take the language and the knowledge that we have about the law and transform it into some formal representation or some computational tool, right? This is briefly put as the knowledge acquisition problem. How do you transform from what we're able to do and how we represent it, text as the law written as text, into some formal technical representation? So, you know, a lot of people have discussed this over time. How do you take natural language and transform it? And we know that there are a huge range of very specific problems that need to be addressed in this process of transformation. And these are almost entirely problems having to do with language and linguistics and all of the things that language and linguistics connects to, that is the communicative process, both between two individuals and at the larger social level where there are many, many participants, right? And we know that there's, you know, ambiguity, there's vagueness, there are whole range of interpretive matters. There's even a micro level of, you know, what is the lexical element? What's the word or the phrase? And exactly what does it mean? And a great deal of, legal discussion about disputes over terminology and the extension of the terminology, right? AI in law has talked about these example problems for a while. Other people are talking about things about pragmatics, that is language in use. When I say it's cold in here, I'm actually giving a request for somebody to close the window. So I'm not explicitly asking for somebody to close the window, but there is this pragmatic notion. And then as people in AI and law have talked about, there's notions of defeasibility and argumentation and these kinds of things. So there's a lot of linguistic issue to address, separate really from the law per se, right? But the law being in language, all of the linguistic issues are imported into this. Particularly, there's been a long tradition in syntax and semantics of natural language about how do you translate sentences of natural languages or discourses of natural language into some formal, that is a logic or mathematics, and then also how do you implement this in a program. And what we know from those studies is that given the multiplicity or the heterogeneity of language, or more particularly the analysis of language, how do you arrive at some convergence? How do you agree on this piece of text has this formal representation, okay? And even among people who work in this transformation from natural language into logic, there's a great diversity of opinion about how you do this and what's the resulting translation of this. So for the law, this need for convergence to some degree is extremely important. Now, we know that lawyers disagree and legislators disagree about it, the interpretation of a particular piece of law, but it can't just be any possible interpretation. There may be multiplicities of interpretation and representation, but those are not unbounded, right? So we need to have some way of converging, relatively speaking, on some of the representations and interpretations that we have. And this, to me, is really a very, very important problem for progressing the discussion about transforming and using text, legal text, into something that's usable, with computers. So this is the context in which we are largely familiar. I mean, Günther mentioned some specific aspects of this. I completely agree with those things. And I think that there is a way to sort of split off the tasks. And that's me putting on my hat as a linguist and a computer scientist to sort of highlight the role of scientific approach towards these problems, right? So this is what I would put this as biting the bullet. At some point, we say there is a fundamental scientific problem that we need to address. And the way to address this is really to adopt some of the scientific method towards the aspects of the analysis of legal language and the transformation of legal language into a formal computational system, as well as trying to accommodate the various sort of sociological and political issues that are there. And there is a large background in this kind of work, right? There is a long history of formal syntax and semantics of natural language that addresses this problem of translating from language to some formal representation. There's a long tradition of knowledge engineering, that is, how do you extract knowledge from experts and put it into some formal representation. Even within the scientific enterprise, we know that there are a range of problems and issues that need to be addressed, but it nonetheless kind of scopes what you can and cannot do. That is, you pick a particular problem, maybe a fragment of the work that you need to do. You need to do a series of experiments, encountering a great deal of failure along the way. You need to develop some kind of structured theory that people can agree with or disagree with in very specific ways. And the structured theory and the experimental process also introduce this very structured, relatively speaking, method of critique. So this is sort of to say adopting, for some purposes, the scientific method and the scientific approach. There is a sacrifice to adopting that approach, which is the dispositions among legal professionals and law school faculty and lawyers towards the way that they look at language. Okay, it is very, very different. Or the analysis of the legal language. My experience has been it's a very different disposition, and we need to kind of figure out where to apply what. Now, there are several caveats, of course, to taking up the scientific disposition towards the analysis of legal language. One is that it's very unclear how this really blends with the social or political agenda, right? We see this issue about the interface of science and social political agendas in other domains, whether it's global warming or genetically modified genes or human reproduction. That whole interface between scientific practice and scientific method and social, legal, political dimensions, that's one area that has to be considered. We also have to consider the great frustrations that go along with the scientific method towards any domain. We all know, obviously, that there has been tremendous progress in science across the board, and yet there are some extremely important, pressing, very large-scale open questions that remain. That's the nature of scientific practice. Whether the legal, social, political dimension will tolerate those open questions, that's something that, in a sense, the scientific method doesn't approach, can't address, really. Then there are the concerns that, for instance, Burkhard just mentioned about, what's the role of, technologists or scientists in, working with the law, and do you hand over the keys to the programmers? And what I would take as a disposition is to say, no, please don't do that, really. Really try to make a separation between the scientific enterprise of really trying to come to grips with the language of the law and the knowledge of the law, and don't impose on that community, the requirements of being the legislative drafters. That can only be done really at the interface. So it's kind of the claim that I'm making is to try to separate off the scientific enterprise, not, sealed off, but try to emphasize a strong difference between that and the legal enterprise and the social political enterprise. And yet there'll be a community of us that are in the middle that can have this kind of cross communication to progress, the agenda on both sides of the picture. So thank you very much for the opportunity to make some remarks here.
Thank you very much. That were the presentations from our panel. Very interesting one. Now we have a first round of questions, particularly from the audience. The first one is maybe the most interesting. Are the rules for legal drafting? Matthew mentioned some of them, and maybe someone else will also say, yes, there are many rules actually, but the compliance is a bit it has to be developed, I must say, yes, particularly when it's a night and all are very tired and have to come to an agreement, then nobody really checks if it's compliant with drafting code. If there's a text available, then it is, and language is very flexible. And also what Günther Schefbeck said once, it's for a lawmaker, for a member of parliament, not so easy to draft its own laws. Normally they can't do it anymore. They need support to get some kind of sufficient coherence with the existing legal rules. That this new rule does somehow fit within the whole body of law. And that's not easy to do. That has to be many, many checks. And when you have an error here, then you have real problems. If it's not computable, that's a minor problem in practice so far. So actually, maybe Matthew may address what kind of good codes of legal drafting we have. There are in every jurisdiction, there are some, but maybe new ones. How to do computable law, please, Matthew, and maybe others may follow. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I mean, it's an interesting question. My perspective is from Commonwealth traditions of drafting, which is more disciplined than many others. The United States drafts by haggling on the floor of the democratic chambers, and they produce wording that is pleasing to politicians, and heaven help the people who have to make out the legal intent. There's an unfortunate element in EU law of some EU legislation being produced by haggling between officials. The UK has a huge statute book going back to many, many centuries ago, which is impossible to tidy. But a lot of the Commonwealth jurisdictions have all of their legislation drafted by one professional service, which uses one set of rules. The rules are there to be broken to some degree, but they are much more published now than they were. I think it was Günther mentioned the previous UK Parliamentary Council, Geoffrey Bowman, talking about legislative drafting as an art. Even the UK have moved away to some degree from that artistic, I am producing a work of art and nobody can question me, into, well, they do now publish their drafting manual, which they never did before. But Australian states in particular, several of them have very strict drafting rules, which are rigorously enforced inside those offices. Obviously, people looking at a statute book won't necessarily appreciate that because you're looking at a historical document with lots of legislation drafted before these rules came in. But I've given some links in the chat, and I've got some links in my PowerPoint. But the Commonwealth Association of Legislative Council now publishes links to all its member offices' drafting manuals, so people can see them. There's also textbooks, like the one produced by Helen Zanthaki, the Thornton book, which cover the general principles. What I would like to do next at some point, don't have the time, is to publish more about how to some degree, unwritten rules of Commonwealth legislative drafting actually work as compared to a controlled natural language or a logical system. The other thing I would just say quickly is, to repeat what I said before, what you see as published legislation is the frozen product. Before it gets frozen, while it's in our hands, it is fluid. And it is not inevitable that we chose to express it in a particular way, but we are trying to agree with our policy officials what this means. What is this going to achieve? What is this going to do? And at that point, some logical expression of the rules that we're trying to do would be extremely useful, even if the public never saw it. It would be useful just in helping us to be more logical and in helping us to be sure that we are doing what our instructing officers want.
Thank you, Master. A very important remark. There are professional services in many countries, in the administration mostly, not so much in parliament. And it would be wise to listen more to them as they have done in the past, more than now. But we will see, yes, we have to train the members of parliament to see, yes, it's not so easy to draft. It's maybe also rely on legal logic, on visualizations, on text to improve it as such. I guess that's an important statement. The other one is also related to you, Matthew. It's a bit, is it easy doing a smaller jurisdiction and a bigger one? Or just for Europe, as I can say, and also Volker may say that it's so huge, meaning you publish so much, so we have to work very hard to get it published in sufficient quality, use XML structure, use maybe citations, metadata, use tool consolidations, that's also important. But more it's difficult because you always have the impression I have to do it for the whole European law, and that's impossible. The smaller, it's maybe better to be innovative. That's a bit my impression. What's your opinion on that?
Certainly smaller jurisdictions are able to be more nimble. We have a smaller statute book. We're able to corral it better. But we have less resources. And perhaps that explains why I've focused on Microsoft Excel, because everybody has that. I'm trying to get drafters from smaller jurisdictions to start looking at this and start moving towards the more complex work that's been done. And I think that in the small jurisdictions, that could take off. And once it starts rolling, the bigger jurisdictions may then put their bigger resources into it, and something may come out of that.
Yes, just from my side, a comment also, explaining a bit the Heydt, and also what Adam Wyner said, the understanding of language, legal language. It's very different for computer scientists. It's ambiguous language they can't really solve. They can only say we can't solve it. For lawyers, they have a procedure available. It's work, nice case, money to make, and procedures. So it's a different approach for lawyers. It's not a big problem if it's ambiguous, because it's work. Adam, you disagree?
Yeah, no, I agree. Let me just take it in a slightly different direction. You know, I take the work that Matthew does, and the kind of legislative drafting process as, to put it bluntly, raw data. It is how you do things, right? Maybe I have a different view about what computer scientists and linguists should be doing than, narrow, I'm going to write this in Java or Prolog or Python, right? I don't see it that way. So when you talk about, the process, or you talk about the ambiguity, or you talk about resolution methods, my role is to look over your shoulder, Matthew, and to listen in on your conversations, and to try to absorb as best as I can what it is that you're doing, what the material is that you're working on, and how it is that you do it. Ask some questions so that I understand, and maybe make explicit to you things that you're doing, and maybe narrow in a little bit of what we're doing for the piece of work, but then to try to model that.
Yes.
My role is to model what you do and how you see it, and not to impose an interpretation or to change the form. So, I would take it rather differently, and take this as all very interesting input for my understanding, so that things can be modeled, rather than you must do as I say. It's not that way at all for me.
I think
Then we move to a remark of Burkhard, Schafer on that. The question is, if we do code, if we do visualization, who should do that? Burkhard, Schafer meant it should be done also by parliaments. I'm sure they should be involved, but still, as a counter argument, in Germany, Austria, we have textbooks, in UK too, and these textbooks are produced not by the official journals, they're produced by the publishing sector. We have commentaries, and actually most people rely on that. I think that's sufficient, because it's easier to change and modify, but there should be some kind of legal rule saying, yes, if you use an app or a code, that's at least some assumption that it's considered as correct. It's not like the text where you can rely on and say, yes, it's my right, but still, if you do it, you are maybe wrong, but you're not punished anymore because you have used it, and you are not liable for misusing it. It's mostly just you are wrong as such. It may be the same for visualization, for easier, readable, understandable versions of it, but it's not, and it's quite clear that this work cannot be done by the publication offices. It's maybe then a cooperation between the lawyers, the practice, administrations, and also some work. And also have to mention that we have already rules where say, yes, the publication offices can do more, particularly when it comes to consolidations, Austrian one, the European one. then a republication of rules. So there's these provisions maybe extended and say, yes, why not have a check from the publication office or the parliament saying, yes, this looks a quite nice logical code of this law, and that's it. And also when you see the Adam Wyner again, it's good for the public to make disagreements public, even if the parliaments wouldn't like it. Because then we see, yes, we couldn't agree, but still it's there in the text. And nowadays you have to study a week or more to find out that there's no agreement. They have all this kind of side knowledge and internal knowledge, and you see, that's not a good practice. That's quite clear, and also a problem of European law that the text we would use are not really for the European citizen, and even for the European law, for the lawyers, it's not so easy to read. But still, don't forget that there's more energy in practice than in the legislative drafting. When you see the numbers of lawyers involved, 100,000 in Germany, and drafting maybe much less. So the practice makes a lot of clear rules compared to this kind of, let's say, the statutes that are produced by the parliaments, some kind of a step on it. It depends a bit on the various culture of the laws. We have then also a bit a question concerning the TÜV question, the standards. As you know, the constitutional courts can do that, but first for Austria, I can only say that, but Günther maybe add to that, the standard is very, very high, a bit like the citizen is considered as very, very intelligent by the constitutional courts. So in the stance, he reads on a daily basis the official journal in Austria, understands everything, and also he reads the jurisprudence and all this. And only if it's too complicated, then the constitutional court may say, no, that's not applicable because it doesn't fit the standard. We don't have much concerning this kind of codes for computational law. And there was also another question concerning, do we use some kind of additional representation languages, like Flora 2, it was mentioned, maybe the main again. No, we are still mostly based on XML, some kind of bibliographic data, metadata, citations, but we haven't yet moved to a very comprehensive knowledge representation language, but there are many, many prototypes available actually, so it's easy to move on actually. And so what you will say about standards, I mean, then the courts say, yes, we don't agree anymore that this is acceptable to the citizens. So we say, yes, if it's not readable, understandable, if it's not an app available, not a visualization, then it's not applicable law. So more standards, higher standards from publication services, from courts. The parliament say, yes, we cannot do everything, particularly when it comes to COVID-19, where it seemed to be everything was possible if there was a need for no. Who would like to comment on that?
I mean, just two things to say. I mean, there were lots of things you touched upon, but one problem that I've observed in some jurisdictions, and I think that is totally unacceptable, is that industrial standards, ISO standards and similars are now integrated, directly referenced in legislation. And when they were then copied, there was an American case, they actually copied the standard into the law and were sued for copyright violation, because you have to pay for the law. And sorry, that can't be right. There's something fundamentally wrong with the notion that in order for me as a citizen to find out what the law is, I have to pay a private entity to tell me what their standards are. So that is, I think, the worst model of confluence between technological standards and knowledge and legal knowledge. Having said that, you're obviously right. People do rely and have to pay for readable versions of the law for a long time, because what Parliament produce very often isn't. And I mean, in the UK, we had this really strange situation, if you think about it. As a common law system, obviously, quite a lot of our lawmaking was traditionally done by the courts. But the court reports were published by a private commercial entity. And all the editing was done by commercial editors. So again, the only access to the law was commercially mediated in rather problematic ways. I think we need to think, yes, I do think we need to think of learning from other fields of norm making or norm generation. So as you know, in computer system development, everyone is talking about agile development. That I think is interesting because on the one hand, we need to think about how do we regulate products that are the outcome of agile development processes, but also can we think of agile lawmaking? Can we think of the way in which computer scientists have collaborated for a long time through the sort of recursive step of trying something out, getting feedback, pushing something on a stack. I think there are more interesting novel ways that we can learn from also for more traditional forms of lawmaking.
Yes, thank you, Burkhard. We're coming to a close, and Stefan Eder is insisting that the lunch break should be kept because as a human right, to get a lunch, to eat and drink. And the next session starts at 2 o'clock. There are many questions not dealt with. So we will maybe then do it via the chat or the emails, particularly when it comes to ambiguity question. You have to see the law as a system with all the lawyers, the citizens, and still law is also produced for lawyers. You shouldn't forget that. And you get some rule when you ask a lawyer, particularly a very competent one, and that will not change, but we can improve the level of availability of law, treat contracts, making it clear by having instruments available that you don't need a law for everything. In particular, we're still working that the law is accessible to everybody. We're still a bit burdened by history where law was available to those who could afford it. And also what Burkhard Schafer mentioned, the court reports were available to those who could pay for it. Yes, that was it, because the others had to rely on some kind of a practice, custom, and still many cases it's very important because the courts are so far away and the lawyers are too expensive. So we have to give, and what you see in the knowledge society, law is considered more and more as a guidance to be on the right side, and people are accepting it also in the COVID-19. And we have to work on that to make better compliance, and also see in Europe, America, we have to give examples and provide tools for developing world because they have now moved the law to databases, information systems, a huge improvement, even it was so difficult to do. And that we should follow, and particularly the project like in Jersey or Swansea, Edinburgh, Vienna, Athens are examples. What's the best practice to do, and particularly also when it comes to the lawmakers, they are burdened by getting to yes, I would say, but still the more tools available, and it's if they produce a good result, it's also good for their electorate in the very end.